Right now in your home, you have running water, you have indoor plumbing, you live or work in a multi-story building. You think of these as features of the modern world. But here is the thing that should stop you cold. A civilization living on a small Greek island had all of those things 4,000 years ago. Multi-story palaces, flush toilets, hot and cold running water piped through clay channels beneath the floors. They had it centuries before Rome, millennia before most of Europe. And almost no one today knows their name. They were Europe's first advanced civilization. They built a maritime empire that dominated the ancient Mediterranean. Their art was so sophisticated, so joyful and vivid that it still astonishes archaeologists today. They traded with Egypt, with Anatolia, with the entire ancient world. And then in the span of a single generation, they were gone. Their writing has never been deciphered. Their real name has never been recovered. The name we use for them was borrowed from a myth. This is the story of the Minoans, who they were, what they built, how they vanished, and why a civilization this extraordinary was almost erased from history entirely. To understand the Minoans, you have to understand what the world looked like in 3000 BCE. In Egypt, the first pharaohs were unifying the Nile Valley. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians were inventing writing, mathematics, the wheel. Everywhere across the ancient Near East, the first urban civilizations were clawing their way into existence. Walled cities, rigid hierarchies, warrior kings, armies. This was the world the Minoans were born into, and from the very beginning they were different. The island of Crete sits at the crossroads of three continents, roughly equidistant from Europe, Africa, and Asia. Roughly 260 kilometers long, rugged, mountainous, with fertile coastal plains and a natural harbor geography that made it ideal for sea trade. Humans had lived on Crete for thousands of years before the Minoans emerged, but around 2700 BCE, something began to change. Villages consolidated. Population grew. And on the northern coast, along the fertile plain near the modern city of Heraklion, the foundations of something remarkable were being laid. By 2000 BCE, the Minoans had built their first palaces, not temples, not fortresses, palaces vast, labyrinthine administrative and ceremonial complexes that functioned as the beating hearts of an entire civilization. The largest at Knossos covered 20,000 square meters. It had over 1,000 rooms. It had multiple stories. It had a drainage system so sophisticated that engineers in the 20th century marveled at it. Terracotta pipes with parabolic curves designed to prevent sediment buildup. Flush toilets that used collected rainwater. Ventilation shafts that cooled interior rooms in the brutal Mediterranean summer. The Minoans were not stumbling into civilization. They were engineering it. But here is the first thing that sets them apart from every other early civilization we know of. No walls. Knossos had no fortifications. None of the Minoan palaces did. In an ancient world where every city-state built defensive walls as a matter of survival, where warfare was the default political language, the Minoans simply didn't bother. Either they felt utterly secure behind the natural moat of the sea, protected by the most powerful navy in the ancient Mediterranean, or they lived in a society so stable, so internally coherent, that mass violence wasn't part of their architecture of fear. Possibly both. Between roughly 1700 and 1450 BCE, Minoan civilization reached its absolute peak. Historians call this the Neopalatial period, the age of the new palaces, and it represents something genuinely extraordinary in world history. Knossos was rebuilt on an even grander scale after a catastrophic earthquake around 1700 BCE. The new palace was larger, more complex, more breathtaking. So were Phaistos on the southern coast, and Malia, and Zakros. These weren't just buildings. They were command centers for an entire economic system. Grain, olive oil, wine, wool, and bronze were collected, stored, and redistributed from these palaces in a managed economy that fed and clothed tens of thousands of people across the island. And the Minoans traded. Constantly. Obsessively. Their merchant ships carried Cretan pottery, olive oil, and wine to Egypt, to Cyprus, to the Levant, to the Aegean Islands, to mainland Greece. Egyptian tomb paintings from the 15th century BCE show figures labeled Keftiu, the Egyptian word for Crete, carrying distinctive Minoan vessels as tribute gifts to the pharaoh. Minoan pottery fragments have been found as far east as the Syrian coast and as far south as the Egyptian delta. Minoan artistic motifs appear in the frescoes of ancient Avaris in northern Egypt. This wasn't casual contact. This was a civilization at the center of a Bronze Age trade network that stretched from North Africa to the Black Sea. But what makes the Minoans genuinely unlike anything else in the ancient world is their art. Every great ancient civilization produced art. Egypt produced monumental, rigid, formally prescribed art, gods with animal heads, pharaohs frozen in eternal pose. every figure governed by strict canonical rules. Mesopotamia produced imposing martial art, kings crushing enemies, gods passing down law codes, power made visible in stone. The Minoans painted dolphins. They painted women in elaborate tiered skirts and open bodices gathering saffron flowers in a blue landscape. They painted young men and women leaping over bulls, grasping the horns, somersaulting over the animal's back in scenes of breathtaking athletic drama. They painted blue monkeys, flying fish, swallows in flight. Spring meadows of wild lilies. Their art is joyful in a way that almost nothing else from the ancient world is joyful. It pulses with movement, color, life. Art historians use the phrase horror vacui, fear of empty space, to describe how Minoan artists filled every corner of their frescoes with life. There are no grim proclamations of royal power, no scenes of conquest, no slaves kneeling before gods, just life. The living world celebrated in pigment on plaster. The snake goddess figurines recovered from Knossos, small ceramic or faience figures of women holding snakes in each outstretched hand, with elaborate headdresses and exposed breasts, suggest a religious culture centered on female divine power. Women appear throughout Minoan art in positions of prominence, presiding over ceremonies, seated in positions of honor, performing sacred rituals. Whether this means Minoan society was matriarchal in any formal political sense is debated, but the contrast with the warrior-king iconography of neighboring civilizations could not be sharper. And they had writing. 2 scripts, actually. The first, called Linear A, emerged around 1800 BCE. It was used for administrative records, for inventories of goods stored in the palace warehouses, possibly for religious texts. It has never been deciphered. As of today, in 2026, Linear A remains one of the great unsolved puzzles in the history of human language. We know what it looks like. We can identify its symbols. We cannot read it. The Minoans still have not told us in their own words who they were. Sometime around 1628 BCE, the date is contested but clustered within a decade on either side, the island of Thera exploded. Thera is the island we now call Santorini, roughly 110 kilometers north of Crete. And what happened there was not a volcanic eruption in any ordinary sense. It was one of the largest volcanic events in the last 10,000 years of human history, a super eruption that blew an estimated 60 cubic kilometers of rock and ash into the atmosphere. The blast was heard, according to geological models, as far away as Scandinavia. A volcanic winter descended on the eastern Mediterranean. Crops failed. Sea levels shifted from the tsunamis that radiated outward in every direction at hundreds of kilometers per hour. On Crete, the northern coastlines took the first tsunami waves directly. Archaeological evidence at Minoan harbor sites shows massive destruction layers consistent with catastrophic flooding. The palace at Akrotiri on Thera itself, a thriving Minoan town, was buried under 12 meters of volcanic ash and preserved in extraordinary detail, earning it the title of the Minoan Pompeii. Excavations there since 1967 by the archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos have revealed multi-story buildings, frescoes of stunning quality, storage jars still in their original positions, streets of a Bronze Age city frozen in a single moment. The Theran eruption shook Minoan civilization, but it did not end it. Knossos was rebuilt. The palaces were repaired, trade continued. For another century and a half, the Minoans endured. But then, around 1450 BCE, something catastrophic happened. Across Crete, palace after palace was destroyed. Malia destroyed, Phaistos destroyed, Zakros destroyed. Akrotiri was already gone. Knossos was spared, but changed fundamentally. The administrative tablets found in Knossos after 1450 BCE are no longer written in Linear A, they are written in a new script, Linear B, which was deciphered in 1952 by the British architect and amateur linguist Michael Ventris. Linear B, it turned out, was an early form of ancient Greek. The people running Knossos after 1450 BCE were Mycenaeans, Greek-speaking warriors from the mainland who had learned from the Minoans, traded with the Minoans, and then in a single violent generation conquered them. How exactly it happened is still argued. A coordinated Mycenaean invasion, an internal Minoan collapse weakened by the Thera disaster into which the Mycenaeans moved opportunistically, a slave revolt, we don't know. The Minoans left no record of their own destruction. The Mycenaeans, who inherited their civilization, wrote over their identity in a different language. By 1375 BCE, Knossos itself burned for the final time. The palace that had stood for 1,000 years fell to rubble and was never rebuilt. The civilization that had produced some of the most remarkable art, architecture, and technology in Bronze Age history ceased to exist as a distinct culture. And the world, moving forward into new empires and new stories, largely forgot them. The Minoans were not entirely erased. They survived in myth. The Greeks who came after them, who owed so much of their early culture to Minoan contact, preserved the memory of Crete in their foundational stories. The Labyrinth, the Minotaur, King Minos, Daedalus, and Icarus. These myths are now understood by most scholars as garbled cultural memory of the Minoan world. The great palace at Knossos, with its 1,000 winding rooms, becoming the legendary labyrinth. The bull, which appears everywhere in Minoan art and religion, becoming the monstrous creature at its center. The tribute paid by Athens to Minos, 7 young men and 7 young women sent to Crete regularly, possibly a distorted memory of Minoan political dominance over mainland Greek settlements. But the myths are all the Greeks preserved. They did not remember the Minoan name. They did not preserve their language. They did not record their history. And then came the silence of centuries, 2,000 years of silence. The Minoans were not rediscovered until 1900 CE, when the British archaeologist Arthur Evans purchased the land above the ruins of Knossos and began excavating. What Evans found there stunned the scholarly world: a palace of extraordinary complexity. Frescoes of impossible beauty, an entire civilization that no one had known existed. Evans named them Minoans after the mythical King Minos, because he had no other name to give them. He spent the next 30 years at Knossos excavating and, controversially, reconstructing. Evans rebuilt large sections of the palace in reinforced concrete, repainting frescoes based on fragmentary evidence, making interpretive decisions that later archaeologists have questioned bitterly. The Knossos you can visit today is partly Evans' imagination as much as Minoan reality. But Evans' central discovery was real and electrifying. Europe had a first civilization that predated Greece and Rome by over 1,000 years. The story of Western history had to be rewritten to include a chapter that had been entirely missing. Why were they forgotten? The answer is architectural and linguistic. Unlike Egypt, whose monuments were too massive to ignore and whose hieroglyphics were eventually deciphered, the Minoans left no Rosetta Stone. Linear A remains unreadable. Without written records in a known language, a civilization has no voice. It cannot advocate for its own memory. The Mycenaeans who displaced them wrote the Minoans out of the historical record simply by writing in a different language about different things. The Bronze Age collapse that swept across the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE, destroying Mycenaean Greece, Hittite Anatolia, Ugarit, and much of the ancient world, erased whatever institutional memory remained. The Minoans were doubly erased, once by the Mycenaeans who conquered them, and once by the Bronze Age collapse that erased even the conquerors. What they have left us, though, is extraordinary. The frescoes of Knossos and Akrotiri stand as some of the most beautiful paintings produced by any human hand anywhere in the ancient world. Their drainage and plumbing technology was not matched in Europe until the 19th century. Their trade networks prefigured the Mediterranean economic systems that would later underpin classical Greece and Rome. Their apparent embrace of female religious authority, of art as celebration rather than propaganda, of a civilization built around commerce and sea power rather than conquest and walls. These represent a path not taken in Western history, a model of civilization that flourished and was extinguished before it could pass its values forward. And there is one final haunting connection. Plato, writing in Athens around 360 BCE, described a great island civilization in the Atlantic, powerful, sophisticated, suddenly swallowed by the sea. He called it Atlantis. Most historians regard Atlantis as a philosophical allegory. But the parallels with the Minoan world, a great island civilization, destroyed in a catastrophe connected to the sea, its memory preserved only in myth and fragmentary legend, are difficult to entirely dismiss. Perhaps the most advanced civilization Europe had ever produced survived, in the end, only as a ghost story. History is full of civilizations like the Minoans, peoples who built remarkable things, asked profound questions, and were buried not just by time, but by the stories that came after them. If you want to keep uncovering the chapters of human history that didn't make it into the textbooks, the empires that vanished, the discoveries that were suppressed, the civilizations that shouldn't have been forgotten, subscribe. Every week, this channel goes looking for the stories that history tried to erase. The Minoans aren't alone. There are dozens more waiting. Here is what the Minoans leave us with 4,000 years after their last palace burned. They built a civilization without walls. In a world where every other culture around them was defined by who they could kill and what they could take, The Minoans seem to have bet on something different, on trade over conquest, on beauty over intimidation, on the sea as a highway rather than a barrier. They were not pacifists. There is evidence of conflict, of political violence, of the hard edges any real civilization must have. But they did not build their identity around war, and they still fell. They were erased by people who did build walls, who did worship conquest, who were willing to burn a palace that had stood for 1,000 years. There is no clean lesson in that. History rarely offers clean lessons. But perhaps there is this. The things a civilization values are not always the things that keep it alive. Sometimes the most beautiful experiments in human organization are also the most fragile. And the fact that we can stand in the ruins of Knossos today, look at the frescoes of those dolphin blue seas and leaping figures and wild spring flowers, and feel something, recognition, grief, wonder, means the Minoans are not entirely gone. They are still speaking to us. We just haven't learned how to read their language yet. Ancient history, forgotten empire, historical mystery, lost civilization, archaeology, Minoans, Bronze Age, Knossos, ancient Greece, Minoan civilization, Santorini eruption, linear undeciphered, ancient Mediterranean, Europe first civilization, Atlantis mystery description. They had running water, multi-story palaces, and flush toilets 4,000 years ago. The Minoans were Europe's first advanced civilization, dominating the ancient Mediterranean from their island fortress of Crete. They traded with Egypt, built the legendary Palace of Knossos, and created art so breathtaking it still astonishes us today. Then, in a single generation, they vanished, and history forgot them entirely. In this documentary, we uncover the full story of the Minoans, who they were, how they built an empire without walls, what the catastrophic Thera eruption of 1628 BCE did to their world, and why Mycenaean conquerors erased their name from history. We also explore the undeciphered mystery of Linear A, the Minoan Pompeii of Akrotiri, and the haunting connection to Plato's legend of Atlantis. Timestamps 0000. Hook. The civilization you never learned about 0045. The Bronze Age Mediterranean world 0300. The rise of the Minoan palaces 0600. The Thera eruption and the turning point 0900. The Mycenaean conquest and erasure 1130. Why this matters today. Ancient history, Minoans, lost civilization, Bronze Age history documentary.